Great. Well, hello. My name is Rebekah Coffman, and I'm here as part of the Tangible Intangible project for the Religion, Art, and Technology Lab. And today we are having a conversation with Sher Afgan Tareen. He has studied American religious history and is currently the co-host of the Political and Theology Network. And today we're talking with him about a project that he put together, related to soup. So I might let him give a stronger introduction to what that means for the tangible, intangible theme. But Cher, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Rebecca, for interviewing me and taking time out to talk about this project. Yes, I created a 20 minutes long, sort of like a visual documentary, I suppose, on a stove that was used to make a white bean soup. By a community of migrants living in Depression era Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
And the soup would become the staple dish of a movement that is better known around the world as the Nation of Islam, which is the movement that this migrant group developed in that milieu. The way I got interested in this story actually had nothing to do with food at all, or the stove. It was part of it is currently envisioned as a large chunk, the first 1/3 of a book project I am currently working on, hope to someday have published. And this book project is basically, comes out of my dissertation work, which actually had nothing to do with food. It was actually a dissertation about the history of the North American Islamic school movement. So, I just wanted to do something that I wanted to write about a topic that was not too much representational, because oftentimes in the study of Islam in America in particular, there's due to the dearth of archival sources on the tradition. If you were to go to like Catholic University of America, you'll find all sorts of archives, meeting minutes, conference, annual this, annual meetings, and the letters of Monsignor to some congressman. You'll find your quintessential historians like gold mines, like, oh, I got the letter, I got the memoir, I got the media, I got everything, let's go cranking. I had none of that, but I was studying to learn how to write history. And here I'm writing about a particular community, a topic called Muslims in Americas, and there's very little archives. Basically, I can count them in my fingers. Like there are two things. There's a manual published in 1970s. You can retrieve that on Amazon, called the Women's Committee, the Muslim Students Association Parental Manual. That's an archive. And there's a novel called The Girl in a Yellow Tangerine Scarf, written by the daughter of one of those women, which could be considered an archive. It's a novel, and that's about it. There's nothing else at all. So I decided to write on education because I thought it's just a topic that I did not have much reaction to. I didn't have any thoughts about, and I thought it will just get me to like write a good like a good boring. And I knew that there's a lot of stuff in Catholic schools, and I thought I'll find a way to like draw on that. Well, what ultimately happened was like all that literature was not that interesting to me. It didn't turn out to be a quintessential education history of Islamic school. Rather, what I found interesting is that the school became kind of data for me rather than my topic. The topic really became motherhood, which I'd never thought about, and motherhood in relationship to the city. So mothers in the city or mothers and the city, because what I found so fascinating was over the course of the North American Islamic school movement, the pioneers are all trying to figure out how to raise children and how to do motherhood in 20th century American urban cities like Detroit. So initially I thought the project would start off around 1960, because this North American Islamic school movement is usually associated with migrants who came from South Asia and places like Iraq and Syria during the 1960s. Now, these migrants are well-educated folks coming, attending like large, expensive public universities in the Midwest region. So a good example is University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, or they're going to like Wisconsin, Cincinnati, this kind of like frost belt region, I suppose you can say. And I thought my story would start there. And then I realized, wait a second, no, the story doesn't start there. If I want to talk about North American Islamic school in terms of, no worries. If I want to talk about that, I should go back in time, because while the term North American Islamic school movement may have been coined by these immigrants, the first pioneer, the first woman to start an Islamic school was actually Clara Muhammad in 1933, Detroit. So she's the first African American woman to start a homeschool movement or a private school movement, and she happens to have done so upon reverting to Islam. So I realized, I got to start the story back there, and so this project was that element that was missing from my work for a long period of time, and I started off this project right about when COVID started. So it's been like about 2 years that I've been working on.
Okay. First of all, wow, that was like so many things in 5 minutes that
I go long.
wanting to. No. It's just so much I want to spur off of. But I'm like, okay,
yeah.
I'm gonna turn back towards what the project is that you submitted, just because there's so much to discuss, even just in the idea of schools, the idea of
I know.
motherhood, feminism in Islam. We're gonna start with the video. Because basically you start with this idea of a stove as an artifact, right? So like something very physical that is basically embodying a story, or embodying, basically by the end of the video, the idea of theology and spiritual presence itself is like inherent in the artifact of a stove, almost to the point of like food as memory, or food as experience, or food as kind of unlocking something that connects an everyday experience to kind of a spiritual realm. And so I thought maybe you could talk about, I guess, given there is so much you could have brought into the narrative, why you wanted to start with the stove as kind of the first point.
So I started with the stove to just frame my all the stuff I wanted to talk about. There's so much there, right? Because I go like centuries ago, all the way through the history of Detroit, etc. And there's so much there, because there's a guy coming from Lahore to Detroit. He's meeting a woman who has come from Cordell, Georgia. There's an encounter between them. Then there's this larger milieu of scientific motherhood, which is women leveraging insights from the field of chemistry on nutritional intake, how this completely fundamentally changing American conceptions of eating, whereby prior to these new discoveries in chemistry, eating was thought of as some kind of like a leisurely activity, where the more tastier the food, the more grandeur, the more food there is, the better it is, the richer you are, the more you eat. And around late 1880s, 1890s onwards, you have women leveraging scientific, insights on nutrition, and being able to like demarcate food based on how much nutritional value you can yield out of each food item, as opposed to dishes. And they're saying we need to maximize the nutritional value, even if that means eating not as much food. So, American yearning for like yogurt parfait, let's say, or a granola bar, that history goes back to this time period, because it's not too savory, it's not too much, it's very little, but it's actually healthy, right? So there's that element. There was so much going on. So I thought, like, how do I frame this avalanche of stuff I want to talk about, because it gets crazy. Where do you start? Where's the story going? So I thought, let's start with the stove, because that is the story. The story to me is very fascinating. So what I'll just quickly do is just tell the story for the viewers very shortly, like in a minute, and then what kind of analysis I wanted to do on the story. The story is, you have a woman from Cordell, Georgia. She comes to Detroit with her 2 children, following her husband, who had arrived in Detroit a year earlier, in search for opportunities, like so many migrants from the Delta, the region, like Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, what they call the Georgia, Piedmont, Georgia, and the Mississippi Delta, that region. You have this mass migration. They come to Detroit, and Detroit has like, the economics is chaotic. Sometimes you have employment, other times there is no employment. So her husband, this guy named Elijah, he's working and he's getting fired from his job and working again. He's periodically experiencing joblessness. She's working as a domestic servant, which is what most women, migrant women that is, could do, because they did not have opportunities to work in the factories or in the steel mills, because those works were seen as things men do. There are some aberrations. There's one metal company that started hiring African-American women, but it was an aberration to the norm. Most migrant women could either work as a domestic servant or in foundry, and so that's what they did. Then this period of economic instability of the 1920s culminates with the Great Depression, when boom, Detroit collapses. Henry Ford, who had been financing the education system, financing so much. The city was run by these corporate elites, like Henry Leland, who was in charge of the Chevrolet, I think, automobile company, and Henry Ford, of course, with the Ford company. These guys ran the city, and they decide to disinvest from the education. They're like, we're not going to spend more money because there's no tax coming back, because nobody's employed, stock market crashes. In the midst of this woman from Georgia, Clara, her neighbor tells her, you got to meet this guy, Fard. He's selling silk on this street called Hastings Street, which is a street that goes north and south. It doesn't exist anymore. It used to go all the way from Detroit River in the southern edge of the city up north. And it was part of this neighborhood called the Black Bottom or the Paradise Valley neighborhood, which is directly east of downtown Detroit and was very segregated. So the migrants used to live there, and they used to work in downtown and other parts of the city. Initially, the migrants were Jews from Eastern Europe. Then 1890s onwards, the Jews start to go on the outskirts of the city, and the homes where they used to live at, now those African-American migrants are living there. So on this Hastings Street, this guy, he's from Lahore, current day Pakistan, back then British subcontinent. And he's basically working as a missionary. He's spreading Islam, and he's spreading Islam as not so much a religion, but as a health regime. And in his talking points, he brought up, hygiene and food and how to raise children, because even in the Indian subcontinent, the missionaries coming from England, they are establishing nursing schools. They are basically trying to reform. They're trying to enlist women to do scientific forms of motherhood, whereby women could leverage insights from biomedicine on how to raise children. And it's a key component of public health. So this is a global story, really. It's happening all around the world. So what I find so fascinating is that the questions Clara has to face in Detroit with regards to the suspicion that migrant women are not good at raising their children because they're spending their entire days working as domestic servants in the homes of white families, and the sense that they're ignorant about how to raise children because they don't know this chemistry insights about food. So they're giving us dyspepsia. That is the homeowner, right? These women are giving our children dyspepsia. They don't know how to cook food. Surely they're negligent. They're not looking after their own kids. So it's so fascinating to me is that in her encounter with the stuff he's saying resonates with her, because this is a global thing. It's what everybody was talking about: hygiene and proper eating, diet, and the kind of pressures it would create for women on how to raise children. Anyways, the story is he teaches them this recipe for a bean soup, and he says, go find the women like Clara and her sister friends. They go fetch some pink beans in the city. So they go around, I'm assuming, in the streets of the neighborhood, and they come back and they say, we have some good news. We got beans, but couldn't find pink beans. We found navy beans. And the guy, being very pragmatic, says, that's fine. So it's not a doctrinal thing that you have to have pink bean. The guy's literally coming up with a recipe on his own. It's not in the Quran or anything like that, right? So it's such a refreshing story, because we usually think about religion. You said there's doctrine, and then you have to follow the doctrines, and it's timeless, but it's actually all just happening in this spontaneous. It's just a guy helping these migrant women how to make food that is cheap and healthy, and doesn't make you dependent on social workers who are providing welfare money to these women. And in return for being recipient for the money, they have to now just do whatever those women tell them to do. One of them is to send the children to the public schools. So what Clara does is that upon learning this recipe, she essentially establishes her own homeschool movement. And when the social workers come with the police to tell Clara, you got to send these kids to Detroit public school because it's a public health mandate. And she says, go, no, I won't, just hell with you, over my dead body is the famous quote, like she said. And that's basically, and they're kind of like taken aback, like, what the hell is going on here? Who is this woman? And then they start doing studies on the Muslim families of the Hastings Street versus the non-Muslim, to figure out what the hell is going on with these group of families that are starting to practice this religion called Islam. And it has everything to do with motherhood, and the maternal practice here is feeding kids. And this soup itself perhaps was taught as well to the kids. But what was so interesting is there is an assignment that children, even to this day, because I know about this from interviewing Clara's granddaughter, Halima Mohammed, who currently lives in Atlanta area, she was able to recite this story, which was a bedtime story that was told to children. And it's a story about an enslaved African who has forgotten that he's a Muslim because of the food that was given to him by his slave owners, and how through eating, you are able to remember your forgotten Islamic past. So I was so fascinated by how like this is an educational curriculum, also a bedtime story, which is still remembered to this day. And that's sort of like kind of reveals the life of this homeschool Islamic school movement, that even the granddaughter could like tell me this story by heart. So that's basically the story. What I find interesting about the story is how scientific motherhood is being enacted upon migrant women by predominantly white women who are learning how to professionalize in these new scientific fields like social work, child development, psychology. But Clara does it differently than how they are teaching her. And she does it differently via this obscure figure of Fard, who comes from Lahore and then gets deported basically by the FBI and never to be seen again. And the difference to me is the memory part, the story, the bedtime story, because in the scientific realm, as it is being popularly taught, there is this notion of a linear progression in a human's life where you go from child to an adult. But for Clara, there is no stage of life called childhood that is separate from adulthood, whereby you go from a child to an adult, but rather it's more generational, whereby you're constantly remembering your past ancestors. So you're not progressing into adulthood so much as you are remembering your past to remake a kind of a future. And this is where Amanda has been helpful in making me think about it, because she's really good at explaining like the temporal aspect of all of this. Because like, why would you remember these like Muslim ancestors, or what is this like? Why is this story so fascinating? Why would you think about your ancestors who had forgotten they were Muslim? What is that doing for you in like 1930 Detroit? And what it's doing, at least in terms of the contrast for me, was it's so different than what was being taught to the social workers. With the social workers, there is an element of where it's severing familial relationships, because for these children to be raised the right way, they have to actually sever their ties with their parents. They have to learn how to be a proper adult, which is to not be linked with their families anymore. And so I think Clara recognizes that, which is why she opposes sending her kids to Detroit public school system, because she sees that the public school is severing her ties with their children. And instead, she is developing these ancestral ties which had not existed before, with these Muslims that she is all of a sudden now remembering, a past that was forgotten because of the food that was eaten, right? So that's sort of the gist of it.
Yeah, it's an incredibly rich story. Again, like so many themes within it. I would love to bring up.
I know.
I'll think of a couple for this moment, and then if we have to do 6 parts, we'll decide.
No, this is like already 20 minutes. I told you
right.
this.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the idea of coming at this from schools is of course so interesting. And I guess for myself, I am a mother, and I think about that process of kind of like inculcating your child into society, and like, what are the processes by which we feel like we need to, out of a sense of judgment and self-preservation. I mean, that in and of itself is a conversation for another time. But in this story, it's particularly interesting because, my thoughts went to things, of course, like, native boarding schools, and like how this not just scientific, but it's religious weaponization almost of what education is, and when we say like inculcate, we mean it, where it's saying we're intentionally taking you away from those that nurture you and instill this within you so that you become something different, right? And so like, historically, this is what, 50 years? I mean, those schools went on for years and years and years, but we're talking, they started very intentionally in the 19th century. And now we're looking in 1930s and seeing how again, this idea of like scientific progression of how women are supposed to understand and raise their children, uh, being balanced by a reclamation of saying maybe that's not the only way.
That's
And
yes,
like
yes,
the forcefulness with which she has to do it, to basically say, I'm sorry, not only do I know how to raise my children, but like
yes.
you're expecting me to take care of your family, you know,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
I'm here to take care of you and you're just telling me
Right.
I don't know how to do this. How does that make sense? You know, and I loved that you opened up with that story of the French woman not being able to find the right kind of wet nurse. You know, like it was just a really nice
Yes,
book
yes,
ending of
yes.
kind of that irony. Anyway, so that's my own tirade for the moment, but we don't have to go down too far. But I did, yeah, just looking back kind of again through some of these themes, you talk a lot about kind of interwoven through the idea of urban renewal as well, you know, where you kind of start out with this story of industrialization through agriculture, eventually kind of leading to urban density, which
Yeah,
then eventually leads to, um, I mean, really intentional urban planning, where it
yeah,
starts out as kind of forming these neighborhoods almost by accident, then it becomes an intentional formation, and then it becomes intentional removal or
structure.
erasure
Yeah, yeah,
through, you know,
absolutely.
highway systems and
Yeah,
redlining and all these
yeah,
things.
yeah.
So I was just maybe wondering if you could touch on that theme a little bit. Again, kind of thinking through like this food as story, you know, as you brought that through, because I
Yeah.
thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I was so taken back by the ways in which Detroit was called a common bowl by the native communities who would
Mhm.
come to this region to hunt for beaver. And the common bowl is, of course, a metaphor rich with food, right? And then what happens is, this is a fabulous, I mean, it's a chapter of a book in a book by Karen Moreno, and it's in a book called or a chapter is called Frontiers in City, or the book is called, anyways. Her main point is, you know, we usually think about colonialism. We kind of like conflate all the colonists as the same group and the colonized as the same group, but she makes a distinction between the French army folks and the French merchants.
Mhm.
The army folks are very invested in like an organized city where everything is delineated and everybody is regulated, and they establish the fort, the military
Mhm.
fort, to contain everything, right? And it creates a lot of tension,
Mhm.
which boils to the story where this Madame Tonti, who is one of the wife of one of the generals, she has a kid, and the kid definitely needs to be taken care of. There's something wrong with the kid, and she needs a vet nurse too. And she couldn't take care of the child, so she needed a vet nurse. And the native women constantly said like, we're willing to do this, and she kept rejecting their offer. And the
Mhm.
child dies at the age of 2 or something like that, because she would only take a French vet nurse. That
Mhm.
was the moment where like the tensions embroiled. One interesting insight of this is like, always pay attention to gender when you're looking at political conflicts,
Mhm.
right? We oftentimes think about, oh, where's the bayonets? Maybe somebody shot someone, maybe there's a war, but really underneath fractions between the natives and the French, it's kind of like tenuous relation. You know, they're settling Detroit. We have to build some partnerships, give and take. Really, it starts to unravel based on that particular story. I find that fascinating, right? It had everything to do with childbirth and motherhood. That's where the sexuality is the realm
Mhm.
where the relations collapse. But the merchants were smarter. Not only are they building like just like partnerships and collaboration with natives, some of them are even intermarrying with the native
Mhm.
communities. And what they realize, we got to follow where the natives go. And the native
Mhm.
communities, they're not settled. They don't just live in Detroit. They come to Detroit, they leave Detroit, then they come back, and then they keep going. They're always on the move. And they go with them wherever the natives travel. So they go all the way down to like Indiana, Ohio River. They're going to go with them in the summer months, etc. And they develop social capital because they have good relationships. And the British, even though the British will come and take over Detroit in this, like, I think it's called the 7 Year War, like 1750s or something like that. They realized that in order for us to not make the same mistake that the French did, we got to build relations with these French merchants. They know how to do it right. I found that really fascinating, right? So what I find interesting there is, with the merchants, they don't see the fort as divorced from this agrarian landscape that was created in this
Mhm.
area. So they say, okay, and it's not to say the merchants are all nice people. They're owning slaves, they're building these massive acres of
Mhm.
agriculture, like they're making money. They're not just like great humanitarians or anything like that, but they recognize that in order to settle this area, you cannot just completely dismiss this common bowl tradition that had
Mhm.
existed there. So
Mhm.
somehow, like, we got to make the fort be enmeshed with the outer parts that had been turned into agriculture. We can't have it all agriculture. We can't be like, just like very sedentary. We have to move things. People have to come and go out of the fort. It's got that, so it creates a very like a metropolitan and urban kind of like entrepot energy rather than like a agrarian sedentary energy. What happens then, however, is that around 1840, which is the year when Detroit public school system is started, actually 1827 is when the fort is demolished. 1840, Detroit public school system starts. And basically, this is the beginning of Detroit becoming an industrial city. This is the advent of big factories, smoke coming out of car plants, metal, etc., right? Which will be the case, which will basically make Detroit by 1890 or 1900 the fourth largest city in America behind Philly, Chicago, and New York. But in this era, if you look at it environmentally, and again, going back to the common bowl, what happens to the common bowl? Well, what happens is it becomes incredibly segregated. Food becomes the realm around the food. You can map the segregation of Detroit around food. So you have the Black Bottom neighborhood, where the migrants live in Detroit. Is right above the Detroit River. That area used to be this web of waterways, and people used to like take their boats and go hunt for beaver, muskrats. They would eat from the fruits that like dangling down. And this guy, Savoyard, French guy, used to like do his painting and pottery. So this river was called River Savoyard. That river turns into a sewage system, a centralized sewage system. So all the water from the city is connected and it's being flushed into the Detroit River, and it stinks. And I think that's where the bottom, the name Black Bottom comes from, the bottom of the city, where all the sewage is ultimately is discharged into the river. And of course, that's where the poor migrants are kept, because they can't live elsewhere because of housing ordinance, etc., zoning laws. Right directly to the east of that is the downtown. And then, as you said, what happens in 1930s is the Great Depression hits. There is race riots of 1940s because of economic stagnation. People actually used to think back then like this depression thing is just going to be small, like a year or two, everything will be back in order, but it never happens, right? Like, just keeps going on and on. So there was actually quite a surprise for people who had been living through that. This is like such a big deal. And then, of course, gives rise to the race riots. And after that, they just decide to just wreck just build a highway, build the Ford Stadium where the Detroit Lions play, and the I don't know what's that called, where the Tigers play. So the baseball stadium, the football stadium, high-rising apartments, nice, and a little park. And then basically that whole region, Black Bottom, is completely erased as a result. The Ford factory relocates into the outer suburbs. And so now people are driving to the factory rather than the factory being in the city. In that whole story, another interesting part is the role of saloons. And this is where I find it so interesting, because in the Clara story, of course, there's that tension between Clara and the social workers, which I find interesting. What I find equally interesting is the larger global forces that are in many ways propelling Clara and the social workers in similar directions, meaning this emphasis on raising children in a scientific way, which both of them are invested in. Because everybody is invested in people, women in South Africa, women in Pakistan, women everywhere are. It's just that is a global shift, right? And this is where the saloon is really interesting. So I did not know, I don't know if you know, Rebecca, because back then people used to be able to go to saloons and eat free lunches. They could like order like all kinds of really good stuff, like oysters, like fish and chips, like really good, like bloody, like like watery, like mouth watering kind of stuff. And they used to feed, and so the people used to go there came from all class backgrounds. You had rich lawyers, doctors going there, but you also had like the factory workers going there for their lunch because they were hungry as hell, having worked in the the assembly lines building a car. The problem with the saloon is, in order to get the free lunch, you have to purchase the booze.
Right.
What incentivizes to purchase the booze is all the salt in the food, because you're getting thirsty. And so this is how they made the money. So the women are incredibly against this. And this is across the racial dynamics, right? The white women, black women dynamics is 100% their complete clash. But across racial dynamics, what I find fascinating is that women across the board, they find the saloons to be a big issue. So women reformers in the Detroit public school system, even, which Clara would reject, even there, share with Clara this suspicion of the saloons. So Clara's issue with saloon is her husband gets drunk because he's jobless, and she's losing a husband to like alcoholism because of the saloon. And the women, the white women are upset about it as well, because alcoholism was, I suppose, a really big issue back then. One way to kind of like read this history is that, oh, these women are so prurient and they're against booze because they're just so religiously like right-wing, etc. But that's sort of a more modern reception history. Older history of like women like Emma Willard, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and has a statue of her in the Capitol of DC, like plays a really key role in the constitutional amendment that that makes liquor sale illegal. They were genuinely really worried about the role alcohol had in destroying familial relationships. Like men are just getting drunk, and like men are not around there, and it's breaking the family down. So the large story short is, when you look at the 20th century city of Detroit, there is an impulse to reform the city, and this suspicion that full throttle industrialization is not good. We need to somehow go back to our the way things were back in the day. And it's shared by women across the educational board, both women who play a pioneer role in educational reforms in the Detroit public school system, as well as women like Clara who are rejecting Detroit public school system, of course, because the school system is reinforcing certain racial stereotypes about Black children as malnourished, Black children as not well raised, etc. And so it makes total sense for Clara to reject it. It also makes total sense to recognize that the larger impulse to where the scientific motherhood really is about making the city more domestic, making the city more amenable to women's concerns that are not being met by just full throttle industrialization. So outlying saloons, the kitchen becomes key, right? So why do I start with the story? Another answer is I wanted to start in the kitchen because this material, the stove, is being used inside a house, which is not really a house. It was above a theater in Hastings Street called the Castle Theater. It was located right above the theater. So that's where the first time the Nation of Islam gathers. And I wanted to start there because the home becomes a really prized space for raising children, mitigating spread of infectious diseases, in particular tuberculosis, which was big in the 1920s and was seen as a disease that was spread from Black bodies onto white bodies, even though across 19th century tuberculosis was the biggest killer in America and it killed everybody. But for some reason, well, the reason is economic hardships in the 1920s becomes associated with Black children, right? And so I wanted to start there because I find the similarities between the women also just as striking as, of course, the differences, because what it shows is that scientific motherhood is going to be creating racial differences between white motherhood and Black motherhood. And Clara is acutely aware of that, and she wants to do scientific motherhood in a way that allows her to do religious piety differently than the kind of assumptions, perhaps Western Christian-centric assumptions undergirding scientific motherhood too, right? So religion is, when you said, this is not just science, it's kind of like a religious crusade, you are 100% right, because there are certain ideas about psychology and child development where religion is playing a role, but religion is being redone in a scientific language, perhaps. The idea of the child has to be reformed into an adult. There is clear religious undertones to it, but the overtone is actually all science now. So I find these figures like Ella Eaton, the wife of the guy who started the Kellogg cereal, right? I find her to be both a scientist and a mother, as well as somebody who's doing a kind of religious revival through the veneer of science. And Clara is part of that story as well. She's doing Islam, but if you were to ask them, what is Islam? They'll say it's a health regime, right? And that's where I think a lot of Muslims, immigrant Muslims, they come across the Nation of Islam, they get confused by it. They're like, where's the Quran? Where's the Sharia? Where's the Sunnah? Where's the Tafsir, the quintessential Islamic study stuff? And it's like, you're asking the wrong questions. You got to understand the American milieu here. All the global, you got to look at this tradition through cooking, nutrition, health, hygiene, science, motherhood, not through Islamic exegesis, which is we get so holed up in our Islamic studies or study of religion training. That's where like folks like you do material stuff, art history, you guys will get it much better than like a religion person will get, because religion person will read this perhaps, and I'm being a little like negative, but just to make a point, they may read and say like, where's the Quran, where's the commentary on gender? So it's like, that's not important here. It's about the stove, it's about learning how to cook the beans soup.
Right. Well, it's like, and isn't that fascinating, right? Because again, I'm still kind of trying to circle this around that tangible and intangible theme. And I think that's the whole point, is like, how often when we're talking about embodiment of religious practice, we feel like we need to have these esoteric framings for it, right? Where it is like, well, the reason she made soup is this hadith, and that's the story, right?
Yes.
And it's not as simple as, which it's never simple, right? As you framed, like, it's not simple.
I know.
But the simpleness of, I'm nourishing my child in the way that I feel I need to. And that nourishment, yes, is physical, and yes, is spiritual, and yes, has lineage, and yes, has heritage, right? And it's like a reclamation process of those things. And sure, we could probably find some verses somewhere to back that up if we needed to, but like, if we needed to, and
exactly,
like,
and we don't.
right, exactly. And like, I think that's actually just so beautiful, to kind of say it's okay to have this practice and form that nourishes, and all these, I mean, I think you talk about there are even like specific weight regimens involved. I mean, this was a very regimented process. It
that's
wasn't
that scientific thing. That's the word.
Right.
Like, you can see the science then coming down to precise 120 pounds, 150 pounds.
Right. Like, this is the healthy body that you need to be. But like, it's an interesting marriage of it, right? Because it isn't saying, we need to substitute complete scientific understanding for this like full body reclamation. And I love that. Okay, I do recognize that we've gone over our 20 minutes.
I know.
Maybe we can end it on one final theme.
Sure.
Just kind of looking back into this kind of overall trajectory you've walked us through, of so many layers of conversation of, I guess, the form of Islam in America, Nation of Islam's reclamation within that, femininity, family structure, urban development, agriculture. I'm like, you've layered it all in there. I guess in leaning towards that, what are kind of your final conclusions, if that's even a right statement, of how you could see this legacy, I guess, going forward, or what kind of inspires you to keep looking for it today?
The relevance in today's society. So one relevance is, and this is a theme that doesn't appear at all, and so it's like actually a good way to, I guess, bring it up. Artificial intelligence. Another theme I'm really interested in my work, because the scientific motherhood, and which basically boils down to the idea that women knowing scientific principles and applying that in their everyday chores, domestic chores, that is, of like eating, hygiene, etc. That, I think, is what gives rise to artificial intelligence, by which I mean to do scientific motherhood was to do intelligent motherhood, and it was artificially constructed through the scientific discoveries and insights in biomedicine in particular, right? And I say that because the threat that was seen as a public health threat was a seemingly bizarre category called feeble-mindedness. So it's not like a cough or like a fever. It's like feeble-mindedness. It sounds like a subjective category. Whereas the physical, but debility there, I don't see it. But it was huge. It was rife across like late 19th, early 20th century. The idea being that that lack of intelligence, or this sort of like weak mind, could be generationally transferred from one woman to the other. It was deeply eugenic like language. It was very insulting stuff, like the idea being like, if you married a woman who was of a lower, who was feeble-minded, then like you would give like rise to a generation of feeble-minded children. So, and complete like made up genealogy. So this guy like Henry Goddard, who's like a big name, a figure in psychology as well, comes up with this totally made up story about like the Kaliakis family. It's like totally a genealogy he makes out of his imagination of a guy who marries a good woman and then has good strong-minded children, then he goes like has as a concubine and like a tavern he meets who's like uneducated, etc., and then like that lineage gives rise to the feeble-minded. Now what happens is it gets weaponized against migrant women, the idea being that they're feeble-minded and they're giving rise to this generation of feeble-minded children. So public health mandate. Why is Detroit public school system attendance a public health mandate? It has a lot to do with stopping the feeble-minded lineage. You're letting these kids spend time with social workers, educators who are trained in the science so that they could then become proper adults, meaning they're having no relation to their families, right? And so I'm really fascinated by the ways in which, and of course, artificial intelligence, this kind of like conventional notion of artificial intelligence, of information, like big data, the idea that like you give a set of information and then the person will execute that command perfectly. It's also happening in the assembly lines, right? So the Henry Ford is one of his genius is the assembly line production, like the TE assembly line, where no one knows what everybody else is doing on the plant, but everybody has a set of like directions they have to follow, and then it all leads to the making of the car. So people are not working collaboratively. Everybody is like isolated in the little stations, and they're just given instructions. You do this. You put a little like I don't know, I'm making it up, but you just put a hammer in there, and then like the part of the car goes to the next station. Then you do this, but people don't know what they're all doing together, right? That sort of is, and then like scientific mother is like really about making this is where like the binary between industry and home is constructed. It's like the separate spheres is a myth, because the stuff happening in the car factories are being put into use in the home as well, and it's all part of the science and technology turn, right? Like scientifically advanced, technologically advanced, etc. So one of the insights for us today is like when you think about AI, and its importance in the home, to what extent are mothers being conditioned to raise children in an intelligent way that is very much a legacy of this era that I talk about, where you're given certain instructions on how to like raise children, and you see that in the child development stuff too. So the women who are social workers coming to Clara's home, they're taking classes at this institute called the Merrill Palmer School, just like few blocks up north in Detroit. The Merrill Palmer School, they're basically learning this kind of like child development, where like a mother has to be constantly observing her child's seemingly mundane acts. How long does the child sleep? How long do they spend in the restroom? And like take these copious notes. And the school, they have to do the same thing. Like how, and that's a kind of like a surveillance mechanism of raising children. AI, that's the big issue with AI in smart cities. It's often advertised in terms of security. Well, you're going to have these cameras in the subway, make sure nobody's sexually assaulting anyone. But the point is like the eyes are seeing you everywhere. You're never like in privacy. You're always being looked and watched, and it heightens racial tensions in the city. Sort of the unsaid thing, or maybe it's now being said more openly, but like the smart city is potentially a very racist city, because it's leveraging these digital eyes to see people everywhere, and it's oftentimes seen with like criminology and crime. So like motherhood is a key part of this facet, because the home is the site where we see technologies like I don't know, Alexa, for instance, is there, she always watching you. Why is Alexa female? why couldn't it be Mark? And so, that's where Amanda's helping. She's like, you do know, Cher, there's all this like ads about like, it's like AI is always a woman. I'm like, oh, really? Is that the thing? She's like, you got to watch more movies. I was like, yeah, I guess you have a point. So I think that's one of the key insights about Clara is resisting a kind of the scientific motherhood she's resisting is also one that gives rise to like a certain notion of artificial intelligence. And so she sees intelligence differently, I suppose. She sees that are more relational, having a lot to do with memory, and having a lot to do with, I guess, this is the part I'm like thinking it through, but definitely different than a kind of thing where the adult is always keeping their eyes on the child because the child is going through a separate stage of life called childhood. No, that's not the way they see it. Even the homeschool is not for children. Adults are taking classes. I mean, it's the entire community. There is no, it's not a homeschool for children. It's just what it's what was before there was even a temple. It's like this Islam in America starts as a homeschool, not as a religious gathering at a mosque at all. It's like the temple number one was basically this little like gathering above the theater. So yeah, so I think AI and motherhood and the home today is the key.
Right. It's so fascinating. My mind is like instantly leaped to the architecture of prisons and the architecture of schools and the panopticon and
Oh
like
yes, yes.
all of that, and then I should say, my own maternal guilt right now while my child's on an iPad so I can record this conversation and the substitution, of technology for motherhood is like,
Yeah.
it is something so pressing all the time. And
But
I
see
think
but in a way, the question would be just to finish with that example, like, what's better? Should the mother be regulating what the child is saying on the iPhone or not? Right.
right,
That's where the question comes up. Like you said, the
right.
home, you said the prison and the school, the home, it becomes a key side too, right? What is the role of technology? Because it's going to be around, So
Right.
one way is to be like completely fearful of technology.
Mhm.
But if you were to look at Clara's insight, I think the fear may not be the right approach. I think there's a different approach where you can totally embrace it, but you have to understand that like you got to enter into kind of like a relationship of give and back with the technology rather than being completely dependent on it, right? So I think that's
Mhm.
the kind of like discussions that this particular point, this life of Clara can raise questions about. And the last part of my future book project is
Mhm.
a principle of a current Islamic school where like they are like using iPads and to like, especially what did they do after COVID? They went back to they put it all in the home, but they were acutely aware that like it could create mental health issues for children at home. So how do you
Mhm.
overcome that? So I think her story of FIFA Said is her name would be even more like applicable because that's the more
Mhm.
contemporary example.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, so many fascinating themes.
Yeah,
I feel like we only scratched the surface, and this
I
was
think so.
still much longer than I told you it would be. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for
Yeah,
submitting this to the project.
oh,
It's
yeah,
really
thank
great to have it
you.
a part of
Thanks to
it.
you because it's always it feels good when somebody else is like taking interest in what you've been up to and like asking questions. It's like the respect from you to me is the more interesting one because I've never like been in a scenario where like somebody's asking me questions about my work. That's very like that's super respectful from you. So
Well, please.
yeah,
I'm
absolutely. Yeah.
very, very happy to have it a part of it. So thank you so
Yeah.
much, Cher.
Right on. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Bye.